Welcome to the Conjugate Nation podcast.
We are back. So today we've got a guest on. This is the owner of RepOne. So one of the things that's come up a bunch of times over the last episodes with us, I know that people have reached out via DM, I think to all of us, talking a little bit about the sort of dynamic effort method and how we're actually applying a metric to that. So just that piece of being able to, we know the percentages, we've talked a lot about that, but attaching it to when we say the bar needs to be moving at 0.7 to 0.9 meters a second, what that actually looks like in practice. So one of the things that for sure I think we've all sort of been referring to has been that RepOne device. That's what we're using in our gym. Chris is using it as well. I think Shane's got some experience with it. So we reached out and we've brought in the specialist to talk specifically about the product, how it can be used. And today's discussion is going to be around velocity.
So when we're looking at, I obviously teach a Conjugate powerlifting course, so I'm going all over the place teaching people how to do speed work, things like that. Our percentages aren't 100% set in stone. Those percentages are what the majority of people, after they've spent a little bit of time in this program, should be right around what their weights should be for band tension and for bar weight. But what we found is when I teach seminars, I often say most of you should start with about 5% less on the bar weight for the first 2 or 3 week waves, because you're still not going to move the bar the way we want you to, the speed we want. But what's important is not the percentage, it's actually the bar speed. But we're just giving you percentages to get the majority of people to that bar speed. But realize if you make a mistake, if you're wrong about the weight that you should use, then you might not be training this particular type of strength that we want you to, which means you're not going to make an improvement in that particular type of speed. The other problem that I notice that we have is people become complacent. So when I do have someone who's spent 6 months or a year in my gym, they get substantially faster. Well, when they don't even try really that hard and they're moving faster than they used to, they still think they're going fast because it is still faster than when they first came in. But what we found when we have anything that measures bar speed is that people can become very consistent with that actual speed that they're producing, because it's like being competitive. If you're training, you're measuring something, you're probably pretty competitive. And when you're competitive, it's like, man, I just moved that 0.84 meters per second. I want to hit 0.87. I want to hit 0.9. And you're trying to push it harder, and harder. But there's a lot of different components to this. As we go along, you can actually track whenever we do maxes. Our max resets our percentage, right? So if we take a percentage of bar weight and our max goes up, that means we have more weight on the bar. But for us, particularly, we're usually right around 0.8 meters to 1 meter per second, but we want that variation, okay? Because we don't want to create a speed barrier. If we train the same speed all the time, we can create a speed barrier. We actually want that variation. So if you redo your maxes too soon, or you take too long to redo your maxes, you might not get enough variation there that we want. So there's actually a lot of reasons why we'll want to measure the speed on the bar. One, to make sure we're training an exact type of speed, an exact type of strength that we want that'll transfer to the sport that we're training for. This also controls our volume. So we actually control our volume, since power is measured in time, not in weight. We use a time component, a speed component to that, and that gives us our volume that we utilize. So we want to be as accurate as possible on this. But I think a massive component, like I said, is make sure we have the right bar speed and make sure we're looking at that speed so we're moving as fast as we can and we're consistently pushing that speed as hard as we can.
So before we get too far down the rabbit hole, Jordan, do you want to talk us through what exactly the product is for people who are unfamiliar with it?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Happy to be here. Really appreciate you guys inviting me on. I can go ahead and give you guys a background on the company and about what products we have. I should probably start with myself first. My personal background is in powerlifting. And so what feels like a generation ago, I won a junior national championship in USA powerlifting and an open national championship the year after. And I was able to represent Team USA at Worlds in 2014, and subsequently retired from my personal activity in powerlifting in favor of coaching. And during that time, I had a coach, a guy named Dr. Mike Zordos, who at the time was getting his PhD and who has since been, very active in the world of research and velocity-based training and autoregulation. And so I kind of had an early hint into the world of velocity-based training. And back then, I was graduating college. I didn't have the money to buy these devices that are several $1,000s. Mm-hmm. So I went ahead and with my mechatronics degree, right, I just graduated, in this field that merges mechanical and electrical engineering. I said I could build one of these things myself. So I built the first one in a shoebox, a literal shoebox, out of like $30 worth of components. And we called it the magic shoebox. And my buddy used to carry it around in his trunk of his car. And we have some videos somewhere online of us working out with a shoebox and like a string of yarn attached to a squat rack.
Oh man.
And that got me pretty far. I guess the kind of trajectory is I got some interest in that. I open sourced it, and we had some kind of tepid interest in the open source design. Some people made their own. And then what kind of surprised me, some really interesting people, a guy named Chris Duffin, for example, reached out to us and said, hey, we want to use these with our clients. And he at that time had a huge remote coaching business. And so it made us think like, what are we doing here? I wasn't convinced it was a business at the time. So what we did was we kind of took our open source designs and batched them. We made batches of, the first one was like 100 units and it sold out in 4 minutes. And then a few years later, we made a batch of like 500, which sold out in a couple. But and then I guess when I really thought that this could be a business is when I realized that you could use this data in a way that could be automated and made much easier in a group setting, like some of the people who are coming to us and using them, like let's say in a collegiate weight room, which is kind of our number one customer base right now. And so we kind of moved forward. We created some software, an athlete management system, some client apps. So we have a mobile app and a new one coming out very soon, and a tablet app that sits at every training station. And we have some really cool orgs now in basically every sport and every level of sport in dozens of countries around the world. And they're using them to automate either their weight room, if they're in a team setting, or automate group classes with much more advanced training than they could otherwise do. And part of that's because of the software we made. Part of that is because we were able to bring the cost down so significantly. That's now affordable to buy one of these for every one of your training stations or every one of your athletes in a class.
Yeah, I think we've been using ours for, I think 2 years or more now. My initial piece with it was just the fact that it's so portable. Like it's a tiny little device, like you're talking like 4 inches by 3 inches, maybe. It's magnetic on the base. So you're just attaching it to like a steel 10 or 5 pound plate on the floor. And you're just going to pull the cable out, loop the loop around the end of the barbell, and you're ready to go. So for us, it's crazy fast and easy. We've got one for our gym. Athletes will just grab it, put it on their bar very quickly. They'll either have their partner read off the numbers that it's punching out, or they'll quickly download the app, connect it via Bluetooth, and get that information, so they can review it at the end of the session and then be able to calculate averages for their velocity over their speed squats, speed pulls, etc. The price is I think it's like a third of the price of like a Tendo unit. So that makes it much more attainable, super portable, and very easy to use. You just click it on and attach to the bar. I guess also, to be fair, on the lead in for this is that we've all bought our own. This is not this isn't a sponsor piece at all. Like we just reached out to Jordan to have him on just because we love the product and want to share that information with people, and get that knowledge out there. Yeah.
In the past, I had a Tendo unit that's broke now, but I used a Tendo unit for years. We had them at Westside. We used them for years there. And, once in a while you run into someone having them. But, you look at 15, 20 years ago, you'd buy a Tendo unit and it cost you 3-4 times as much as this product does, And so you look at the investment's a lot cheaper, but you're also talking about a time era where money doesn't go nearly as far as it did, that long ago. So we put a lot of investment into Tendo units when, years ago. They were just expensive. But this is a better product. It is a more convenient product. And the fact is people weren't spending that kind of money. They weren't, not enough people were buying Tendo units, whether they knew how to use them correctly or know how to use them for training, the information, or if it's just they couldn't afford it. It didn't really matter. It just wasn't happening. I think the Conjugate systems, obviously more people know about it now. There are more coaches doing it. A little bit better understanding worldwide about it. So I think that when you're looking at this speed work, you're going to have more people who can use the product, but it's also at a price point that is so much cheaper than what we used to spend, that this is something that now can be a doable product in a gym. And it's a measurable product. Because, with us doing the accounting system, like we want everything measurable, it's a great way to do that.
The other side too is sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Jordan already mentioned earlier, it's just a higher form of training. Like, you get more exact data. And what I've noticed, so I've had one now for a few months, and the first time I actually used it was with you guys at the Conjugate course, Shane and Jesse. The night before on Friday, we were using it with Ellie and Justin, and it was suddenly became, the only measurement we generally have with weight is load, right? Like that's the only thing we have is data. So people, especially, what I notice in CrossFit, I'm sure it's in powerlifting too, is that they get so, focused on what their specific loads are. Like it's got to be heavier. And it's like, no, like this gives you the data. And the first day we noticed it was when you had something to beat, it was a new score. So suddenly people didn't care as much about the weight. Now they're just paying attention to this number and like, can I hit this number? And can I continue to, go a little bit faster? And it's real-time data. And it's training, again, the speeds, because maybe Shane, your athletes, because you're a little bit higher level, but none of our athletes, and even my eye's not trained well enough to know what the speeds of the bar are. So, and for the price of a specialty bar or less, like if you're doing dynamic effort days, I can't recommend them enough. It's too valuable of a tool.
For sure. Like I think that that piece of it being competitive definitely is the case. Like it does get competitive, and it takes it away from people loading too much weight onto a speed day and now neither being heavy enough to produce a good stimulus nor fast enough to produce a good stimulus, versus this really toned it down to being like, get the weight right so you can race on the velocity. And now you're going head to head with people and you're trying to, once everyone's got their weight set, we cycle it for speed squat, speed pulls, and everyone's stepping up. Everyone else is watching the number on that readout. And it's like, when you pull, you're hoping to see like, 0.9, you come up short. The next guy's trying to beat you by a, 0.01 on it. Right. And the other side too, I think that's really worth mentioning is that it is super accurate. So it's very different than what you're seeing for like the units that would slide on the barbell and just connect to your phone and don't have that sort of the cable attached to the unit to read the data. Like what made you choose that versus the other options?
Yeah, so there's a spectrum in the world of velocity-based training of price and accessibility. And it used to be that the spectrum was much more, there's kind of a big valley in the middle where you couldn't get anything that was, both accurate, reliable, and affordable. And when I came into the velocity-based training world, I said, okay, we can solve this problem. We can introduce a product that has all of those aspects of, the top of the line accuracy and reliability. It uses the gold standard in velocity-based training, which is the linear position transducer, right? A tether that attaches to the thing, and then you directly measure how that thing moves in space. And then we were able to bring the cost down through just some, inventive engineering. But that continuum still exists. And on the lower cost side of that continuum, there are free apps now that you can get on your phone, and you can measure your velocity. Now, what's pretty obvious likely is that because it's free, it's not going to be as high of quality of data. But that continuum is shifting every day. I'll tell you the exact answer of why. The frame rate that you can measure at high resolution is the limitation. And as cameras get better resolution and processors get stronger, you're going to be able to, look at your camera's going to be able to look at things that are moving and tag certain pixels and track those with very high accuracy in real time. So that's kind of where this technology is going. But there are other limitations. If you set up a camera, there can't be any obstructions. The angle has to be very good. We looked at all this, all the options available to us, and we said, what is the way that we can offer anybody the best possible data at any time with the strongest price point? And, coming up with our own version of a linear position transducer was the way to do that.
Also, Chris said something about, I spent years at Westside. I spent years watching people on 10 units in my gym. And I got to the point where I was pretty good, where I could walk by and be like, okay, they moved at this rate of speed. But it doesn't really matter what I know. For one, I want it perfect. I want perfect knowledge on it. I want exact, reduplicatable. But even if I tell the client, like, okay, cool, you're like between 0.8, 0.85 meters per second, all right? It still doesn't mean they necessarily believe me. Boom, I'm saying this. And even if they don't, even if they just fully believe me, it doesn't really matter. When they're with other training partners, that competitiveness that you see is huge. But, it's like everybody else. It's like you take that person who's 100 pounds overweight. Your first goal is not to lose 100 pounds. It's like get the first 10 pounds off. Now let's raise, whatever cardio output. Okay, we're going to go another quarter mile with the sled that you did last, that you've been doing with the sled, whatever. You're just trying to do a little more output or losing a little more body fat. You don't give them the 100-pound drop because majority of people will never see that. They need small attainable goals. Well, we have PRs on our max days. So that's 2 days a week. But if we do dynamic work and we're using the same weight on a similar type of movement, we can also have PRs on that. Whatever buys that athlete in into doing the intensity that's required is extremely important. And since we believe in compensatory acceleration training, which is accelerating all the way through range of motion as fast as possible, a lot of people accelerate the first 90%, 95%, and then they back off that acceleration right at the end before they want to go rack the weight or whatever. I hate when people just go back into the rack. I want people to accelerate all the way up, snap, lock out, hold, rack. When they start searching for that speed, the only way they're going to beat the person next to them or beat their old time is if they accelerate all the way through range, which is what I'm looking for. And that also means that they can't start to put it back in the rack prematurely because they're going to lose that speed, and that's not going to transfer over. So you can use this to manipulate people into training the intensities they need to get the output that they want. And you can also use it to manipulate technique by taking people with certain faults and utilizing it as a tool to do that. Okay. So, I look at what our training means to us, and then I use something like this as a tool to achieve those results, whether it's improving technique by the way they accelerate all the way through range, or by giving them a competition, or does that person need to use PRs? Some people love PRs and it keeps them going. Some people just stay the course and do what you tell them. Doesn't really matter. You learn your client's personality type, use this as a tool to empower them and get them where they need to be,
Yeah, and to your point, Shane, you made a couple of really interesting points that I'd like to add to. So, you want to compare velocity-based training across athletes in order to encourage competitiveness. And one of the important things about doing that is making sure that you have reliability across athletes. And that's within the same facility. Sure, if you have one unit, then that, reliability within that one unit is pretty straightforward. But reliability across different products requires typically, in order from a coach's perspective, and you guys are all coaches, in order to be confident that you can get that same reliability, there should be third-party validation. Third-party validation saying that no matter what device you use, and no matter how many times it's being used, no matter how many sessions, it's going to create a number that's comparable to the other number. So if you have, one device that's saying it's, 0.75 meters per second, another device that thinks that same thing is 0.65, well, then that competitiveness, there's a kind of shred of self-doubt. And once the athlete has that doubt, like, are you sure that was faster than that? Then it reduces that kind of competitive edge, I think. And then you also made another really important point, which is the compensatory acceleration training. Maximal intent for speed is critical to velocity-based training. And I can't stress that enough. If you're doing velocity-based training, let's say you have a target of 0.6 meters per second, but you kind of pull off the gas towards the end of the squat, let's say, that information is incorporated into the average concentric velocity. And on my side, I get to do the math, I get to look at all the data, and that stuff really adds up. So if you look at a rep starts from zero velocity and it ends at zero velocity. A lot of the time taken in a rep is spent speeding up and slowing down. And so if you're not every single time speeding up with maximal acceleration throughout the entire range of motion of the lift, then you lose that comparability as well. And that's even within your own training. If the athlete doesn't do that consistently with every rep, it's hard to compare set 1 to set 2 or even rep 1 to rep 2.
Shane, you said something about at the seminar where how many people you've seen at your squat who just ran out of time, and it's like, I thought about that, quite a bit, where it's like you see the lifter in a squat get to 3/4 above parallel, 3/4 of the way through the squat. And then just slowly they just start getting crumbled by the weight, and that's, again, they're not learning to train through those speeds. It's because, like, if you just had them do a quarter squat with that weight, they could do a set of 10. But if that time under tension starts to pick up and creep up longer and longer and longer, the longer it is, then they're not going to be able to finish that lift because they're under tension at those max weights for so long. So if you're not training your body to finish those end ranges of motion, that's always worse. You get right there towards the end and you just can't finish the lockout. The speed training is so good for that.
I guess it puts the piece on, like, why? So for the people who are listening, like, okay, like I like this kind of stuff. Why do we care so much about velocity and the speed work over just doing a second day of maxes?
So here's what I'm going to tell you. Obviously I can explain the West Side system for it, but there's a lot of reasons why to use it, especially when you're looking at a lot of different sports. Okay. So for us, power's measuring time, right? So if Chris puts a weight on his back, he puts 225 on his back. He has X amount of time he has before he can stand up with it, right? Like, if I asked Chris, hey, you can bench 135, right?
Yeah.
Cool. That would take a while. You got to think about that a little bit.
Yeah.
So hopefully,
give me a little respect, Shane.
Yeah. So, but then if I'm like, all right, Chris, well, I want you to bench 135. I want you to do an hour the eccentric and concentric phase, both an hour long. So 2 hours for one rep. Now, can you do the same weight?
No.
So, if Chris is a 500-pound squatter, right? With 400 pounds, he has more time to squat 400 than he does to have squat 500. The more weight on his back, the less time he has to complete the weight. Plain and simple. Okay. So we have to get 100. We want to get to 100% of our output in the shortest time period possible, and we need the weight on us for the least amount of time. Just like bodybuilders, the time under attention is their friend. Time under attention is the enemy for us. We got to get that weight going. But sports are all done at different speeds. Okay. And just like when we work with an Olympic lifter, we can use this in a different manner than we work with a power lifter. Sometimes what we'll do is like say we're working speed strength, right? And for us, when we work speed strength, the reason why we do this is because we can't max out twice a week in lower and upper body. For the way we train, we get overtrained and we have injury rates go up. But what we can do is increase our volume through our speed day, right? So it has to be measurable though. I talk to a lot of people out there. A lot of times I ask people like, hey, how do you decide how to control your volume in training? And they just look at me with a blank look. I'm like, okay, so like when do you increase your volume? Well, sometimes like my training will start to go really good. I start to hit PRs and I increase my volume. Like, do you ever think that you were hitting PRs because your volume was finally perfect? Maybe it was optimal. Then you add weight and you're going to stop your PRs. I don't know. You're guessing. That's kind of the whole point is you're guessing. So basically for us, we use a percentage of our max that gets us roughly to the speed we need. We can use a product like this to dial it in perfect. And then when you have the percentage of bar weight, that gives us our volume, like we'll do say 12 sets of 2. 12 sets of 2 gives us the volume that we need. There's a certain amount of, if you're a 600-pound squatter, there's a certain amount of volume you're going to have to do to remain a 600-pound squatter. Okay. So this gives us the volume that we need to make progressions. When you get stronger and your max goes up, you have more weight on the bar. Your volume goes up. If you get an injury and your weight goes down on your max, well, then your volume drops to be an optimal volume. We don't want minimal. We don't want maximal. We want optimal. Okay. So we use our speed days for two things. It's a sub-maximal load, not heavy enough for us to break technique. So we can perfect technique on that day. It is our high volume day. Our max day is a low volume day. This means we're training a higher volume underneath a sub-maximal load, which means we're not getting fatigued underneath heavy weights. They're going to break technique down, increase injury rate. So it's important to us. Speed work is important to us. I tell you, it's extremely important to us. For us to measure this, it lets us be more accurate, right? But when we're looking at athletes, I can also say I've had athletes that were naturally fast and they couldn't grind long enough. They weren't good at slow strength, right? So like how you have speed strength and strength speed, we will actually take some lifters and take them down to 0.4 meters per second, not on a speed day, but on a max day. So if you take like AJ Roberts, he squatted 12. Actually, I wrote it down just so I can remember the numbers because I don't like to give any false PRs to anybody. So he had 700 pounds of band tension, 510 pounds of bar weight, and he moved it at 0.4 meters per second. That equated his world record at 12:05 in the squat. Okay. But sometimes athletes need to be able to strain for longer periods of time. We can slow that bar speed down and see where that time domain is that transfers over to that maximal lift. So what I've found is as like the power lifters in my gym that become pro level or they are world record holder level, they actually start getting better at grinding longer for longer periods of time. They're also actually fast, but they have to be able to grind for long periods of time. But if you watch lifters, how many times have you seen a lifter bench and 2 inches from lockout, they stop? Deadlift, 1 inch or 2 from top, they stop. Squat, they're right near the top and they stop. Those are all your strong leverage points. These are the strongest positions you can be in. That's why it's because they ran out of time. Okay. But when you're looking at sport, if you don't know what speed you're you're training at? How do you know what sport you're training for? Right? Olympic lifting happens at a substantially faster rate of speed than powerlifting. So when strength and conditioning says they should train the same speeds? No. Okay. You look at someone running 100 meters. If you want to get someone faster in a football team and you want them faster the first 10 meters, that's different than 100 meters, different than 200 meters, different than than a quarter mile, right? But you can take an athlete like in CrossFit, and they have Olympic lifting in CrossFit. They have powerlifting in the sense of like a deadlift or a max squat. They have running components, endurance components. They have speed components. And you can take a look and see the time domains of the different workouts, and you can see who's good at what speeds. And then it lets you know what speed they need to bring up to be competitive in those arenas versus the other athletes, right? But if you're not used to looking at speeds, you're not informed on speeds, you're not going to do that, okay? So for me, when I watch an athlete move, there's two things I look at. Do they maintain position, okay? And where do they lose speed at? Because wherever they lose speed, for me, is where their muscle group is weak at. If they don't have a mobility issue, then it's a strength issue. So it's a particular type of strength that they're lacking, or there's a muscle group that's lacking. So I'm always looking at speed for an athlete. Speed tells me everything I need to know. It lets me know where accessories need to be involved at. Lets me know if we need to train other types of special strengths. When I say special strengths, think explosive power, speed, strength, strength, speed, things like that, different speeds. And wherever you're lacking is what you want to attack. How many athletes have you guys seen where it's like you have a guy come in, never really trained much, it's just violently explosive, and you're just like, man, this is how this guy naturally is. That's awesome. Then you have that lifter, but they'll squat like say 300, and you're like, they can squat 400 or 500 pounds easily. 305, they can't budge it. Then you have that person who they put 200 pounds on their back, and they look like they're about to die. And they put 250, 300, 350, 400, and they work up twice as high as you thought they could do. It's just slow. When you look at those, it's pretty easy what they need. The explosive guy needs to be able to grind. The guy who grinds is real slow. He needs to get faster, right? Tools like this help with that, but really, to me, like everything's based on speed. What sport are you playing? What attributes are you good? Do you have? What attributes don't you have? Where do you lose speed through range of motion? That tells me where I either have a mobility issue or a strength issue, and what types of strengths are you good at? What types of strengths are special strengths are you bad at?
Jordan, you were saying that you're predominantly seeing it show up in a lot of like college, university environments.
Mm-hmm.
How are those guys applying it? Like, what are they up to with it?
Yeah, a lot of our collegiate and professional customers, they use conjugate style programming as well. And if they're not using conjugate style programming, they're using some sort of like a tier training method, something like that. I know that Dr. Brian Mann is really popular in his work in the collegiate setting. It's very different applying velocity-based training in an organization where you have 40, 50 athletes who have to get a good workout in 45 minutes to an hour. It's similar to a CrossFit setting. And the way that they do that typically is by employing methods that are more easily automated, which is kind of a funny way to put it from a strength and conditioning perspective. But when I say automated, I mean something that you can tell the athlete to do, and then they can run off and just do it by themselves. A simple way to automate velocity-based training is just by just writing on a whiteboard a velocity target, and then they all go off and do it on their own. In a setting like a weight room, in a let's say collegiate environment, you're going to want to have velocity at each training station in order to get all of your athletes to hit those targets for each set. But that could be done also in more inventive ways. I know that there was I one time sat in on a workout at Adelphi University on Long Island. This is when I was living in New York City, and they had 4 racks, and they had a group of, I believe it was something like 60 track and field athletes. And the track and field coach at that time, they looked at strength and conditioning like, okay, we have to do this. Okay, we'll do this, right? Or I'm sorry, strength training, right? So they would bring their athletes in, 15 people per rack, and the coach did everything he possibly could to optimize and individualize within the constraints that he had. And from where I was standing, he did a fantastic job at almost an impossible task. He had 4 sensors, which served 60 athletes. and he couldn't vary the weight all that much because how are you going to have 15 people on one rack? He had a 6'2" guy and a 5'2" girl on the same rack. So within that, he just kind of auto-regulated wherever he could. So there's a wide variety of applications, even within collegiate strength and conditioning, and I've seen a ton of different training methods employed.
Yeah, what are those guys putting the velocity meter on? Like, are they using it for squat, dead? Like, are they snatch, clean and jerk? Like, what are they loading up and like metricing?
Yeah. So typically, you have squat, bench, I would say trap bar deadlift, power clean, overhead press. Those are mostly what they're tracking. But I've seen some really interesting stuff being tracked. I've seen dumbbell work tracked. I've seen pull-ups tracked. Also, very common to see jump training being tracked. There's also PAP, where there's all kinds of really interesting modalities beyond just traditional velocity-based training with a barbell.
How are they attaching it for jumps? Like belt?
Yeah, you just hook it onto a belt.
Huh.
Yeah,
do you know what the numbers are they're looking for that? Like when they're doing that?
Strength and conditioning coaches these days, that goes beyond me. I'm old school powerlifting, right? Squat, bench, deadlift is my specialty, and I can tell you about every little nook and cranny in that. I'm not going to pretend I'm not CSCS. I'm not any of that stuff. But they attach to the belt. They have some targets that they use, and over time, they'll adjust them, and they see a ton of success. I had a coach write a blog post that's on RepOneStrength.com, and all about jump training and the effects that he's seen over time in applying that. It's been really advantageous.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
So what all for RepOne, what all does it measure? Like, what are the different things you can do with it? Because I know they were talking about different tools and different things that you can use with it. So can you enlighten us on that, please?
Yeah. So RepOne can measure something like 60 metrics. It's kind of an overwhelming number of metrics, and I'll break that down in different categories. So there's rep metrics, so metrics on each individual rep. So that's your average concentric velocity, peak velocity, range of motion, duration, and a metric that I think is exclusive to us called peak height, which is simply the height that you achieve peak velocity, which is a really interesting metric I can get into a little bit more. Then there's set-based metrics. And the set-based metrics really kind of explode into a bunch of possibilities. So for example, first rep of the set, average concentric velocity, last rep of the set, average concentric velocity, peak end, which is the average of the, let's say, last rep and the slowest rep, which is an interesting psychological phenomenon, basically meaning, you remember an experience based on the most difficult part and the most recent part, right? And then there's, peak end, peak velocity, peak end, there's first rep, peak velocity, last rep, peak velocity, things like this. And with that, you can kind of dive in as deep as you want into the metrics for really any aspect of your training.
And with the app, you're basically getting them all anyway, whether because of the units displaying. Can you select more than just like I've just used average velocity on there, but you can sub that out and have it give you different. Like you can choose a metric it's showing on the display. Is that right?
That's a highly requested feature, and that is on the roadmap. But no, if you want more metrics than what's on the display, then we recommend the app. And we're coming out with a really cool updated app that actually allows you to access our athlete management system for free, create your own velocity-based workout plans and deploy them to your phone for free, and then get live guidance based on the velocities that are coming in versus what you're supposed to be doing in your program. So that is highly anticipated, should be coming out within the next few months. But yeah, I mean, if the basic metrics are on that device's screen, average concentric velocity, peak velocity, range of motion. And if you want more than that, then the app is definitely the way to go. And that's all free.
And just for clarity, so the average velocity and peak velocity. Mm-hmm. So the difference of those two and their value as far as the knowledge goes.
Yeah, I mean, it's like if you're familiar with an iceberg chart, right? At the tip of the iceberg, the comparisons are relatively straightforward, but you can go pretty deep just on those two metrics. So I'll start at the top. Peak velocity is just, let's say RepOne sensor gets 1,000 measurements of your concentric squat, right? Concentric being up usually, right? Because we're on Earth, right? And gravity is pointing down. You get the one fastest out of the 1,000, and that is your peak velocity. The average concentric velocity is just point A to point B, that displacement divided by the duration of that rep. You use average concentric velocity in, let's say, sports like powerlifting, where you want to know the average velocity over the entire lift because it correlates really well with, let's say, rate of perceived exertion, which is a really cool correlation. Peak velocity is really useful in Olympic weightlifting and a lot of CrossFit settings because that peak velocity correlates really well with if you're going to make the lift or not, right? And so there's the training methodologies kind of branch from there. You want to optimize for peak, optimize for average concentric. And to kind of give you a sample of the kind of towards the bottom of that iceberg chart, average concentric velocity, it has its holes. I talked earlier, kind of to Shane's point about how average concentric velocity is no panacea of VBT. If you speed up or slow down differently between reps, that impacts the metric differently. Also, from my side, we do this thing called time weighting, where we remove any individual measurement that's longer than 0.02 meters per second. Because if you get stuck, let's say in the middle of the lift for, a tiny fraction of time, that can disproportionately bleed into the average concentric velocity of the rep, which is very uncommon. Usually throughout the entirety of a lift, you're very smooth. I've barely ever seen that. The much more common time weighting occurrence is, let's say, at the end of a rep, if you have an athlete who's ever locked out really smooth, like dead smooth, well, they don't have that microscopic, sub-millimeter downward motion that we use to end a rep. And so if we don't have that time weighting measurement, then that little bit of time, let's say a little bit of displacement adds to a lot of time. You can have 0.0004 meters per second as a reading, and your average concentric velocity plummets. Other products don't take this into account. And so, that average concentric velocity measurement, which, we thought was so simple and so easy to use, becomes a lot more complex and a lot less useful. I mean,
just to reiterate that is you're saying that sort of the speed and crispness that I finished the lift with, without the sort of the machine taking that into account, can have like quite an effect. Like if I slow down too much in that last millimeter of my squat, it's gonna it could throw the data off substantially.
Depending on which product you use, or if you use like a camera-based system, it'll really confuse a camera-based system.
Yeah.
But even if we back up a little bit, if you just tend to lock out slowly, right? You finish, like Shane said, let's say you don't accelerate throughout the entirety of the lift. You accelerate throughout 80% of it. That last 20% takes you a disproportionate amount of time. Then your average concentric velocity is going to plummet. And then that number becomes a lot less useful.
Yeah. So you're saying that the RepOne then accounts for that and adjusts.
Yeah, that's correct.
Huh.
So the thing is, honestly, it's like, talking about average velocity and that it skews that number, right? If you don't accelerate all the way through. But again, it skews my training if you don't accelerate all the way through your lift too, right? So if you want good feedback, you need to listen to, to your coach and accelerate the way you're supposed to. I guess what I'm getting at is I always like something that makes people improve their technique and understand how to execute a movement is massive. And it's just nice that ends up correlating with being able to help with that,
Yeah, it's a fringe benefit, right? That if you do training well, then you're also going to get good numbers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is always how it is, right? If you do training well, you get good numbers in the competition, or you do training well, and you get good numbers for your feedback on your equipment, on your RepOne. Just how it is, But
yeah, good numbers too. Yeah, and that's what I think was super valuable for me. So, what Louis kind of came up with the prescription that, we generally go in 3-week waves. So week 1, 75%, week 2, 80, week 3, 85%. Shane, Jesse, feel free to jump in here, but you basically got 25% of band tension and the rest is made up by bar weight. And, again, his data is coming from the greatest lifters on earth. So Jesse, we talked a little bit about this, and I know you dropped your bench numbers dramatically a while ago because your athletes just couldn't hit the speeds. I don't even worry about the percentage anymore. I set up the bar, I put the bands around, they connect the RepOne to it. And it's like, hey, you got to stay between 0.7 and 0.9. As soon as it gets to like 0.8 when they're warming up, I just have them hold there, and they're just hitting their reps inside that. If it drops too low, you make adjustments. If it starts getting too high, I generally just leave it right now because there's, everybody's still kind of figuring it out. It's been a few months, but it's nice because I don't have any guesswork. And, Louis obviously did a ton of research, but a West Side powerlifter doesn't necessarily relate to a CrossFit competitor or even a football player. Those are the elite powerlifters in the world. So to be able to just use the machine to tell you where you need to be, it's made my life so much easier. It's awesome.
Well, what I'll tell you is, near the end, before Louis passed away, we were at a meet and my athletes had a pretty good jump in the squat. And he's like, so what are you doing different with the squat? I said, well, actually, I added 5% to the band tension for athletes that are at a certain level, like they're like a pro level, not just a pro level, because if you have someone who moves kind of slow, but they're real strong, not them. But when I have people who are just very explosive and they've gotten really explosive through our training, but they hit a certain level, what you find is they can actually have the weight on their back for, we want them to be able to have the weight on their back for a longer period of time because they're hitting some big numbers. And what you find is they start to be able to strain for a longer period of time if they've been in the sport long enough. This is just like the top, 1% I'd have in my gym or 5% or whatever. And so I went to 30%. He goes, that's funny. He goes, we've made big jumps in squats lately too. And he goes, we're at 33%. So in my gym, you're at 25%. And then over time, only a handful, not many, but a few people I would take to 30%, and then all of a sudden their numbers start going up again. The problem with that is not a lot of coaches have been lucky to have the amount of, I've seen a lot of good lifters for a long period of time in my life. Not a lot of people have had that opportunity, right? And I was lucky to be right next to Lou, and Lou teach me a lot of things, and I got to see different speeds, and I got to see the different changes that we made in training. Like every time you create strength, you create a weakness, right? So we come up with something new, boom, we have a lot of increases in performance, but there's always a negative to it, right? And so what you want to get to the point is that you're good enough coach that you don't, they always say like a good coach knows after meet what you need. A great coach knows before the meet what you need. So you want to become a great coach, but this is a tool because, what you can do is you can start looking at velocities and you can start thinking about what changes you might need to take the athlete to the next step. For us, it was like the first time experiencing humans doing this kind of thing. Once you got to a certain level, then it was like, okay, well, what are we going to do now? What's the change? So things like this will help give you feedback to come up with those decisions sooner. And if you don't have the luxury to have been around that many athletes who move that well, then it helps you have some data to collect that. But we have changed band speeds for certain level of athlete, or band tensions for certain level of athletes. But it does still really come down to, the bar speed. Now, we'll give you a prescribed amount of band tension and bar weight, because if you have too much band tension, you don't have enough bar weight, so you don't get out of the hole. If you have more bar weight, not enough band tension, you get out of the hole, but you're not offsetting your leverage improvement enough. So you're not optimizing that force velocity curve and, optimizing all the way through range of motion. So it is important to get those percentages right. And the thing is, if you're following our percentages and your numbers are skewed, you can make adjustments to that, whether it's bar weight or band tension. If you're new to it, it's probably bar weight. If you've been at it for a really long time, it might be band tension. You might need to increase that tension on that weight, especially if you're someone who can grind for an extended period of time.
When we first got it, for sure, exactly like Chris was saying, is it allowed us to start making decisions for ourselves and what we were seeing in the gym. So we started using it with our CrossFitters, with our powerlifters, with our sport athletes, and just started like observing and analyzing the data like we were collecting in our environment, and then starting to make adjustments and shifts by ourselves to like better accommodate, like, okay, if this is a priority, then are we seeing consistent percentages show up like as a group? And it was interesting with some of those more explosive sports, like, Jamie with the UFC, like she's able to work at prescribed like West Side percentages. But for the most part, most of our other athletes have had to drop pretty substantially to get the velocity correct, by dropping their percentages down. And it's interesting to sort of see that change. Like, certainly I feel like it's made our our work much more valuable for what we're producing. Like I would say, I had this conversation earlier in the day with someone else of like, they're like, oh, do you use box jumps to build this or box jumps to build that? And like, we use our dynamic work and velocity work to build box jumps. It's like when we want to push that up, like that's how we're pushing it up. And then being able to metric that and make calculated adjustments, the same as everything else, right? It's like the more you can sort of like keep things very mechanical and very data driven, the easier it is to make a shift. So if you're seeing an athlete come in, even being able to recognize a change. So being able to catch an athlete who's maybe pushing at that sort of what's everyone saying now? Overreaching productively versus non-productively, like that piece of an athlete who's at the edge of non-productively overreaching and potentially leading into overtrained, which is, very rare in my opinion. You'll see it on velocity and you'll see it on jumps, and you'll watch the number just suddenly be like, oh, this athlete's always able to maintain like this velocity, and suddenly they're just cannot touch that velocity. And you're like, okay, well, is this a one-off day? Like they're, especially with a CrossFitter who's got a ton of diversity in their training, like, are they sore from something from yesterday that's having a negative effect? But if you're starting to see it consistently, like day to day, week to week, that's where you want to know that as quickly as possible and be able to make the corrections for that as quickly as possible. And that those numbers become very important, I think, and especially over time too, is being able to take that data and show the changes for that athlete, like over a season, over a year, and over those large cycles of multi-year training.
Well, and Jesse, actually, what you're doing with the jumping when you're saying like, look, we're looking at speed work and we do different variations of this to increase that box jump. But what you're doing is you're creating a whip, right? And so like for people out there, like a whip is you put together a series of movements that are not the movement that someone does in sport, but gives you the exact calculation of how much improvement you've had in the sport, or if there was any improvement. So when you look at like Ben Johnson running the 100 meters, his coach would say, I didn't even care the last 6 weeks about how fast he ran or about his running. I worried about how high he jumped and what his deadlift was. And if he hit PRs on those, every time in international competition, he ran a faster 100 meters. In powerlifting, like all my athletes, we have whips. I know, like I can watch them and say, okay, here's, if they have these three things, they hit PRs in this, they'll hit a PR in their deadlift or their squat or their bench. And, a lot of people have similar ones, but everybody's different. We're all built different mobility, different leverages, different types of strengths, things like that. But it is important for coaches to be able to create a whip and be able to recognize these different components you can put together to increase the performance of that athlete, right? I say, like, I have exercises I call direct translators and indirect translators. And indirect translators are ones that you get stronger, but don't necessarily directly transition into performance in your sport, like in a powerlifting, squat, bench, deadlift. You have exercises that you get clearly stronger on. But if it doesn't raise your squat, bench, and deadlift, it doesn't matter. And then I have exercises we call direct translators. And those direct translators go into a whip, and that whip gives me I know exactly what's going on with the athlete without them even doing the movement for their sport. Sometimes we use this for an athlete who's in their head a lot. I don't need them to reproduce their main lift or their sport. I just increase that whip so high that it's so easy for them to blow through a PR when they actually do their sport. Then they start to trust me and they relax, and it takes the mental stress off of them, right? But to create that whip, you have to have, data, and it comes back to this as well. Like, you're not worried about a box jump to make the box jump higher, because like, I have so many other things I can do to make a box jump higher. Well, you can create a whip with those other things, but you have something that's measurable, right? So now you measure that bar speed. You're like, okay, they move this weight, this speed. Whenever they're in this speed, this is when their jumps are going really well. They tend not to improve their performance when they're in these speeds, So that's what's really nice about that.
And Jesse, you also said something interesting about the VBT data over time. And I think you get to go a level deeper in the world of VBT when you look at the transient data, how somebody's velocities are changing between sessions, between microcycles, things like that. And that I think that's an opportunity for research. There's not a whole lot of information out there, like published research, but I think it's super powerful if you can kind of analyze those trends as that changes. There's so much insight into kind of long-term fatigue buildup and things like that.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. Like for us, it allowed us to reshape our percentages for recommendations for new people. and they just get started quicker with moving faster on the weights, and then have a much smoother and easier transition. Like I feel like for me, as sort of like tip of the spear with what a lot of stuff we've done, that I spent a lot of time grinding through where I was like neither fast nor heavy, and it just wasted time past, you know, the volume of like building the skill. But now being able to have that where we're like, you know, here's what our percentage is. When you come in, you're like, you know, start at 30%, like 30% for a box squat for speed squats, plus 25% band tension. For someone who's brand new, we'll get them, for us has worked very well to get them up to speed quicker over a couple of weeks than if we said something like 50%. So we'll wave people through on squats at like 30, 35, 40%. And it'll be pretty good for a new person coming in with low experience, low skill. And then for someone higher, you'll see it right away, and you can sort of auto correct that. If you got a, you know, pro athlete coming in who's in a sort of power sport, I mean, their numbers are going to be different, but those have worked like very effectively for us. And I mean, all that's been based off of being able to collect data like in our house. And even if it's not like, I mean, even if it's a bit anecdotal or, you know, it wouldn't make a published paper. I mean, for us, it's still been really high value. We would, for us, like, so speed squats, speed pulls, bench are pretty common. All our sets and reps are pretty normal. Like, you know, 12 sets of 2 for squat, you know, 12 by 1 for dead, 9 by 3 for bench. For you, Jordan, like, what are you applying the velocity meter to for sets and reps?
So, in my opinion, anything above 60% 1RM is ripe for velocity-based training. Below 60% 1RM, there's a lot of application in dynamic effort stuff. Above 60% 1RM, it's really useful in tracking the things that contribute towards your, you know, let's say weekly training volume. So in my mind, let's say in my own training, I've retired from coaching and powerlifting as a sport. I've retired from more things that I haven't retired from, but I can't get away from barbell training. And like, you know, I did a bodybuilding block for a little bit, and I got bored with tears, and it just slowly morphed back into a powerlifting program. But no. So in my own training, if it's above 60% 1RM, then I want to track that. And the anything above 60% 1RM, let's say, I like to track volume the simple way, just reps per week.
Yep.
So, you know, for somebody who's been training for a very long time, the reps per week might approach something like 100 reps on a single lift. And that's when we're talking about somebody who's trying to compete for like the world level in power. If you can get all those tracked, then you're going to be in a really good place.
And what sort of numbers do you see that attach that for velocity? Like, as you're approaching, so above 60%, like if you were going to, would you run it up to a 1 rep max?
Oh yeah. I mean, the velocity range changes. The common velocity ranges change in the world of powerlifting for each different main exercise: squat, bench, and deadlift. And I would say that the slowest lift out of the three is the bench. It's typically the shortest range of motion. And like I said earlier, a lot of that time is spent speeding up and slowing down. So you end up getting, I've seen some obscenely low. I think the slowest bench velocity that I see semi-regularly is 0.05 meters per second. And so some of the people who have trained down their V1RM over, you know, a decade, they'll go on the world stage and they'll hit these really slow grinders. And if you just estimate the average range of motion for a bench of like 350 to 400 millimeters at that level, and you just time it, you could time it on YouTube, just stop it and start it. And then you could see some really slow velocities. I saw once the slowest lift I've ever seen was at the IPF World Championship in 2018, I believe. And it was a female lifter. And I think she was in the 132 pound weight class. I could be wrong, but I estimated that it was something like 0.03 meters per second. It was an 18-second deadlift. I've never seen anything like that. But yeah, I mean, so on the low end, you can get really low, right? Those are outliers. The average, I'd say the lowest you typically see in training in a deadlift for somebody who's advanced is like a 0.15. Squat, if you can hit a 0.2 meters per second or below, you are highly advanced. And for the bench press, I'd say, you know, 0.1 to 0.15, and you are a really highly competitive, or at least highly trained individual. And then when you hit closer to the 60% 1RM range, then you're looking at, you know, 0.6s, maybe 0.7s. And then anything beyond that is going to be more of like the dynamic effort work.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Jesse, I don't know if you've thought about this yet, but have you thought about using this to measure, as an example, like take Justin and measure like a thruster, set a weight, work on speeds. If you're doing something to increase his thruster to get a faster Fran time, is his thruster actually getting faster the same weight? There's certain movements in CrossFit that you could do with people to try different techniques, or if you're working things to get those faster so they do a certain type of watt at a faster time, that I think you could actually use this too to see if maybe what technique is developing faster speed for them, or like is the movements you're doing directly translating into that workout that you want to get them faster at.
Yeah, I'm definitely super curious about that sort of stuff. I mean, to be honest, I actually haven't used the velocity meter on 1RMs, but I'm super curious to sort of see what that looks like. And it's just like, I mean, I don't have any good reason for why we haven't, but yeah, it's like really interesting, the idea of that. I mean, even at the when we did the seminar in April, we when you were talking, Shane, about, you know, we put it on the bar for what were we doing, like we're doing multiple reps,
double reds.
Yeah, like it's just like the idea of like what felt like, could you feel the difference, like a good set, bad set, and how that's attached to velocity.
Well, and you know, and I'm not going to talk about 1 rep max. I'm just saying, like you take Fran, right? 95 pounds is the weight on a thruster for Fran. Well, if we're doing stuff to get, say, I'm just using this as an example. Say we're doing this to get Justin to move faster during a thruster to get his Fran time faster. Let's say his pull-ups are perfect, and you know, and we're like, okay, the only place is I see some guys his height that are actually running the thrusters faster. So here's where we pick up time, right? You can actually measure, because you're going to take 95 pounds. It's a set bar weight. The workout has a set weight to it. And if he can actually just have him do it 1 rep as fast as he can, if he can move it faster, you're doing something right. If it's moving slower, staying the same, it's not translating over. You got to make an adjustment in training.
Yeah, it definitely, like, yeah, I love the idea. Like, I need to think about it a lot more for sure, because the idea of being able to,
let's talk about picking
have some
individual
pieces
movements.
To test. Yeah, that's the thing, right? Is if you had some specific things you were going to test and say, hey, we want to have a positive change on this, being able to attach a velocity metric to those things, like thruster would be a good example of that, of being able to say, hey, this is a set. Here's what we're hitting. Here's this training that we did. So we took that, like the same way you would develop a weakness. Like if you're like, oh, the hamstrings are weak. Like if you felt velocity was weak in a workout, being able to metric that, have a number attached to it, apply training that felt like it would have a positive effect, come back and retest it, and then be able to show a change in that data. I mean, that's pretty fun.
Well, if you take Justin as an example and say, watch the last year's CrossFit Games, right? And then you take the workouts that he lost ground on people. What movement did he lose ground on people? And take those movements, and then you can plug that, take that movement, put together a plan to make an improvement, test at the beginning, test, retest, until you literally increase those speeds on those movements. And now it's like, okay, now we just took something that was a weakness for him and turned it into strength. It's pretty easy. You sit there and just watch the competitions. You know, where did he lose time at? Where is he, you know, and not everything's going to be an output. I get that. It could be technique. It could be physical output. It could be he was fatigued at the time. But, you know, that's what the coach is for, right? You can look at all those events and look at every single one and who did what each. Look at whoever moved everything the best, right? Like in each movement of the workout. And then you can sit there and look at the speed they're moving at, time it, whatever. You can measure his bar speed and say, okay, clearly he's losing speed on this movement. Increase the speed on that movement.
The interesting thing about what you're talking about, Shane, is that it isn't even necessarily velocity. You're talking about just the duration of a lift, which is really important in events for time across different individuals. So I mentioned earlier about the drawbacks of average concentric velocity. If you have different limb lengths, 2 athletes could be outputting the same amount of intent into the bar with the same 1RM, and their average concentric velocities might be different. And now let's say you're doing an event where you all have to do the same number of a lift, and one person's limb lengths are different than the other. All that matters there is the duration. And so if you could shave fractions of time off of each lift, to your point, then you should be able to succeed better at an event.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Like, that's why I'm like, he needs a coach, because the coach is going to decipher, was this a technique issue why he was slower? Is this a structure issue? Like you said, if the other athlete's shorter, of course they're going to get thrusters faster. Okay, but we're losing, and here's some other athletes. Okay, let's say he's the 5th fastest in the thrusters at Fran, but there's an athlete the same height, same arm length, basically same leverages, but he's moving faster. Okay, well, if we can tie that speed or beat that speed, he doesn't have to be the fastest at thrusters, because he might not have the structure to be the fastest at thrusters. He just needs to be able to move it as fast as he possibly can, right? And it could be a tool that when we start looking, and like Jesse, like I'm just using Fran as
Yeah, that's a good one.
Generic example, right? Or thruster. I'm just saying, let's look at the movements, and if we could sit there and say, okay, he has perfect technique in this. All right, it's not a technique issue. Then who are the people who are moving it the fastest or moving it the best, who are similar structures, same type of height, same limb length, whatever it is? And if they're beating him on something, then we need to be able to find a way to get him to match those kind of speeds and velocities. He's winning the games anyway. So if he can tie people at the things they beat him on and out excel them on the things he already wins, he just gets higher placings in the events he doesn't win. So it's plain and simple. He just gets higher points, you know? So, and we know, like, if he got third at every single event, he'd win every CrossFit Games. He doesn't need to win every one. But he will have the movements that he will win or that he's good at. We just need to take the movements that they're his worst movements compared to the people who are at the top that he's competing against, and just need to close the distance. And there has to be at least one of those movements that this will work for. You know, I'm not saying it'll work for everything. Doesn't need to work for everything. Everything you knock off the list only makes them harder to deal with, you know?
Jordan, you were saying, what was those numbers for 1RM that you were attaching to like pro elite level athletes?
Yeah, so that's velocity at 1RM, V1RM.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, experimenting with measuring 1RM. You could also estimate 1RM with velocity. There's a lot of different methods you could use. The simplest are 2.4-point methods, meaning just get a spread of your velocity range of either 2 reps or 4 reps, and just do a linear regression. Just draw a line, and then that line, as you draw it down towards zero velocity, you stop at your V1RM, and that's on the y-axis. And on the x-axis will be your load, right? And that's the load at V1RM, which is your 1 rep max. So yeah, that's really interesting stuff. And there's a free little widget in the RepOne Personal app that allows you to take all of your historical data and clean it up really thoroughly. You can tag your sets. So let's say you have squats, but you have squats, some beltless, some belted. You want to get rid of the beltless ones, and you could chart that stuff over time. And you could even like set a date range, because there's some data that's, let's say, from the previous block. You got a lot stronger this block. Maybe you want to look at this block only. There's entire methods of velocity-based training based on estimating your 1 rep maximum velocity, and let's say just doing percentage-based training after that. It's not fully auto-regulated within session. It's not auto-regulated if you just prescribe percentages, but I would say it's better than doing non-auto-regulated percentage-based training or no VBT at all. It's a simple way to, let's just say, calculate 1RM based on your most recent data, and then go ahead and use simple percentages for the rest of the session.
Yeah. And were you saying that you had numbers like velocities that you've seen sort of at that pro elite level for athletes? Like in general, do you have like windows of like, 0.02 to 0.0 or 0.23? Yeah.
So if you look like a force velocity curve, right? And we're talking about the maximal strength region. In the world of highly competitive powerlifting, these people are off the charts. And we have, with RepOne, we've recorded millions and millions of reps across all of our different customers, when the devices are connected to the app. And so we've looked into our data and pulled out charts, and we have generalized velocity RPE correlation tables, generalized load velocity charts. And I could send those to you if you want to include them in some show notes or something. And then that'll give you an idea of kind of like the average of where the RepOne kind of customer base lands in terms of reps in reserve or percentage of 1 rep max and velocity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I'd love to have a look at that and see what that looks like. That's definitely like outside of like where I've spent much time, but I'm definitely interested. Yeah, absolutely.
Competitive powerlifting, it's a different kind of, I would say, domain of velocity-based training than in the world of, competitive CrossFit or in some collegiate sports, or even in, we have customers who are in golf and swimming, and they use our
Huh.
products differently than any of our other collegiate or thing clients. So yeah, it's just a wide world out there.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
said you worked with a doctor who was doing research on it, and that kind of like pushed you into speed. So, did you do speed training before as a competitive powerlifter, and then what was it about his research, or like what was he researching that kind of got you more intrigued by the velocity training?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was kind of a coincidence. So back then, I was at Florida State University, and the FSC weightlifting club um, needed a coach, and we just happened to have somebody who would turn out to be one of the bigger thought leaders in the sport of powerlifting from a research side. He was there getting his PhD. We had a great exercise science program, and he would compete with us, powerlifter with us, and then we somehow convinced him to coach the team as well. And back then, he was doing his research on novel daily undulating periodization strategies, and he was also at the same time testing on himself what we back then called constitution training, which is daily squat and bench 1RM training, which is just it's a wild fringe style of training. Um, but he's a man of the data, so he would kind of test this on himself. Later, it turned into a research paper that's been published. And so, among all of his different interests, he was researching velocity based training. He's since published a few research papers there, and so I just kind of got lucky to be in his general orbit at the right time.
What did you find was the value to your training then? Like what grabbed you then with that? Like, so as you started to utilize that and be thinking more about it, what were sort of the things that you were like, this is definitely the path?
Well, as I didn't start using velocity-based training until after I graduated college. And so that was after I had my junior national championship, before I had my open national championship. And I was working with Dr. Marzoros remotely. And when you're working remotely with a coach, it's difficult to get that kind of eyes and ears on your training live in that session. You really can only send videos afterwards. And there was this kind of urge to get that feedback. And because I had him as a resource, both from a coaching perspective and also an information perspective, I was able to build my own device that he could then use to coach me. And just let my velocities, be able to make more accurate decisions in real time, and then send him the data to crunch later.
And where are they being manufactured now? Are you still, because I think like when I got mine, I think you were building them in a garage.
Maybe. When was that?
Like two or 3 years ago, I think.
So, well, during the pandemic, I couldn't tell you how many different places we had to build these things in.
Oh yeah.
We were building that. We had a workshop in Brooklyn, and New York City during the pandemic. The whole thing shut down. I couldn't even get into my office for 2 weeks, and that we actually shipped our first units in March of 2020, which is when the pandemic hit. And so we had some pretty angry customers for a little while there. But yeah, I mean, we were building them there. We were building wherever we could. We were building them in my living room.
Yeah.
And during the pandemic, I moved to South Florida, partly because my wife got a new job, partly because I couldn't operate my business.
Yeah.
And so I was building them out of my house for a while because I couldn't get a space where I could work. And then finally, we got an office which is here now, and to this day, I think we're the only linear position transducer made in the USA. That's for sale. Fully made in the USA. We get some parts overseas, but the vast majority of the components are made and assembled here.
That's awesome. Yeah, that stuff's super cool.
We've got a lot going on, and I wish I could tell you guys about it.
Yeah.
We have some things that are a long time coming. I think I alluded to it before we started the podcast, but I mean, what I can say is, when I first decided that this was a company and not an open source project, was when we realized that we could use, velocity-based training in a way that you could actually kind of abstract the velocities away and turn it into guidance, or otherwise make it more simple for people to use. And the way we would do that is by creating software, which is, our mobile app, but also our athlete management system, and soon the mobile app that hooks into our athlete management system. And I'm telling you guys, it's going to be a huge upgrade. And so for the past few years, a lot of what we've been doing with sports teams is kind of changing the way that you run your weight room. With an iPad at each rack, you can create workout plans that are VBT enabled, deploy those to a tablet. You have 3 or 5 athletes going in, and all of them have individualized training loads. And we can give them guidance after they do the set. Hey, you got to go up in weight, or you got to go down in weight, or let's say rest more or rest less, or do more sets or fewer sets. These are all things that we can do automatically live for that athlete. So if you step back, you say, what are we doing? Well, we are automating what would otherwise be difficult or impossible methods of training to do and scale, or for some people to do it all. That doesn't just apply to velocity-based training. There are other kind of training verticals that can apply to, and that's about all I can say. But yeah, we're working on a lot of stuff that's going to be coming out soon. The first of which is a big update to that mobile app, which we're really excited about.
Yeah, man. Yeah, that's super cool. I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, like I said, it's been really productive for us for sure in helping shape the idea of like what these velocities actually look like and making sure that we're doing a good job on our dynamic effort days. I mean, it's 2 of the 4 major days each week. It's been really productive working individually with high performance sport athletes for setting baseline metrics and being able to weigh against those over periods of time, either to show improvement or to sort of red flag things that have come up. I guess the last piece on the list is, so people like, I'm very interested. Best way to, like, I guess, Instagram handle and best way to track down and get a RepOne.
Yeah, we're at RepOne Strength on Instagram. We have a TikTok now, which is cool. I'm a little too old myself, so I have our social media intern do it. But yeah, we do the TikToks, and so you can find us there, I guess. And yeah, RepOneStrength.com. They're available. For a long time, we had a backlog of 8 weeks, like for the first couple of years of our existence. And this year, we finally got out of the backlog. So you can check it out. Feel free. And for the summer, if you're a sports team or a gym and you want to buy a few units and you want to use our software, it's half off Strength OS. And that'll end at the end of summer.
Chris, Shane, anything to add?
Yeah, really enjoyed the device. It's been one of the bigger upgrades to the training program. Just been fun to watch, and actually, listening to you and Shane, like I'm definitely curious to start watching some more stuff, like testing some 10 rep thrusters or 1 rep maxes and just seeing what that looks like, and some more data to hopefully make people stronger and fitter. So yeah, appreciate the product. It's awesome.
Yeah, good job. Yeah, awesome work. And thanks for making time to hop on here and make it happen with us. Cheers. Boom. We'll wrap it up there. I'll put this to a stop and we can keep talking if we want.
Conjugate Nation Podcast.